Section 11.3 and 11.4, other mechanisms of evolution. So there are 5 factors that can lead to evolution. Populations are going to evolve or change in response to their environments. This is expected in all populations most of the time. These 5 factors leading to evolution are genetic drift, gene flow, sexual selection, mutations, and natural selection. Natural selection we've already talked about. Mutations we've already covered a bit, but we'll get more to this coming up. Gene flow is the movement of alleles between populations. Natural selection is not the only mechanism through which populations evolve. When organisms join new populations and reproduce, meaning they move from one population to a new population of the same species, their alleles also become part of the gene pool in the new population. And their alleles are removed from their old population. This movement of alleles is called gene flow, moving from one population to another. This happens when individuals move or into new populations, moving out of their existing population, increases genetic variation of the receiving population, and reduces the variation in the population they left from. Genetic drift is a change in allele frequencies due to chance. Smaller populations are more likely than larger ones to be affected by chance events. Some alleles will decrease in frequency or become eliminated altogether. Other alleles will increase in frequency. This is called genetic drift. Change in allele frequencies that are random causes a loss of genetic diversity. 2 processes cause populations to become small enough for genetic drift to occur. The first is called the bottleneck effect, which we'll talk about later, and the founder effect, which we'll also talk about later. The bottleneck effect is genetic drift that occurs after an event greatly reduces the size of a population or the allele frequencies. Okay, bottleneck effect can be an example of overhunting of elephant seals. The resulting population did not represent the genetic diversity of the original population. Since hunting ended, the population size has grown, but the genetic variation in this population, even though it's much larger, is much less than it was previously to overhunting of the elephant seal. Another one of these is called the founder effect. Genetic drift that occurs after a small number of individuals colonize, meaning start a new area. The gene pool is often different than the original larger population because it doesn't represent the entire population. Think of like even with Darwin's finches in the Galapagos Islands, these small group of finches land on these different islands exposed to different environmental things, and they changed, they actually evolved into brand new species because of the separation and because it was such a small representative of the gene pool as opposed to the larger gene pool that would have been found on the mainland. A couple of issues come up with genetic drift. Number one is there's a loss of genetic variation. Remember, genetic variation is necessary to keep the species viable because you have a lot of different individuals that could handle the environment. And second part would be harmful alleles could become more common since it's a small gene pool. You have a higher chance of 2 heterozygote carriers passing on harmful recessive allele to their offspring. Next is sexual selection, and this occurs when certain traits increase mating success. So mating habits have a big effect on evolution of populations. Both sexes benefit from having offspring that survive. For males, the cost of reproduction is much less than for females. Males can constantly produce sperm. That's not a big deal. They can do it up until the day they die. Females are limited because there's only a certain amount of time where they're going to produce viable eggs. There's only so many eggs that they have, and only for a certain time. So it's much more important to the women to have offspring that survive, making them much more picky about mate selection. So sexual selection occurs when certain traits increase mating success. There are 2 types. Intrasexual, this is where there's competition between the males the winner would then mate with the female, or intersexual, where the males display traits that are going to attract the female. These traits that increase mating success do not always improve survival, but the females use these traits as signs of quality and health of males. It causes these traits to become exaggerated over time. With these bighorn sheep, the males butt heads until one quits, and then the one that is the winner would have the ability to mate. In the peacock, this big display of feathers is to attract the female. The female finds that pleasing in some way and says that you're a better mate, and as a result, that trait gets passed on, which becomes much, much, much more exaggerated than it was in previous peacocks. Mutations and natural selection, we've already talked about, and in terms of this, mutations, remember, are change in the genes or change in the genetic or the base sequence on the genes which are located on the DNA. Natural selection would have those four components that we talked about, which would be variation, overproduction, adaptation, and descent with modification. Both of these would be leading towards evolutionary changes. Evolution is a continuous process. Environments are always changing, so populations must adapt to these environmental changes, or the species will become extinct over time.